Hello. Okay, so some of you will know, I've been based here at the Wordsworth Trust for part of my PhD, and that's titled Wordsworth Creativity and Cumbrian Communities, and it examines the way that Wordsworth interacted with a variety of local communities, his impact on these communities, and their impact on his poetry. So this year, as well as writing my thesis and helping with front of house museum duties, I've used the archive for research and led a number of reading groups, as Jeff was saying, with local people to see how the current community responds to Wordsworth's poetry. In this talk, I'll take you through a series of 3 Grasmere characters who appear in different poems. As a literature student, my approach is to look at the poems first, examining who Wordsworth writes about and how he writes about them, before exploring historical details to gain a better understanding of how his creativity responded to and shaped local characters. I will welcome any questions, comments, or suggestions for further research at the end. So our first character appears in the poem The Pet Lamb, a Pastoral, written by Wordsworth in September 1800. The poem begins with the narrator, Wordsworth, peering over a hedge where he spots little Barbara Lewthwaite, a child of beauty rare, caring for her pet lamb. He is so charmed by the sight of this girl and her lamb that within the poem he composes a ballad, imagining what Barbara might sing to the lamb. What ails thee, young one? What? Why pull so at thy cord? Is it not well with thee? Well, both for bed and board. Thy plot of grass is soft, and green as grass can be. Rest, little young one, rest. What is it that aileth thee? Following 10 stanzas of this imagined song, the poem concludes with a curious act of creative reckoning. And it seemed, as I retraced the ballad line by line, that but half of it was hers, and one half of it was mine. As the narrator walks home, repeating the song, he adjusts the creative balance sheet again in her favour. Nay, said I, more than half to the damsel must belong, for she looked with such a look, and spake with such a tone, that I almost received her heart into my own. The Pet Lamb is one of the few poems in which Wordsworth used the real name of a living person. Barbara Lewthwaite, as mentioned by Margaret before, was born in 1792 and lived in Grove Cottage, half a mile from Dove Cottage. So here's a picture of Grove Cottage today, and this is one from the archive of it about the turn of the century. I thought I'd put the one before where it looks much better than it. But this little lane here became the A591, so it's interesting to see how different it looks. But yeah, so this house is frequently referred to in Dorothy's journal as a local point of reference. For example, we walked up beyond Lewthwaite's. Barbara's younger sister Hannah later worked as a nursemaid to the Wordsworths between 1803 and 1806, and Dorothy described her as the happiest lass in all Grasmere, if she may but be allowed to have John in her arms. And like all poor people's little girls, she is a very notable nurse. We ask her to come about once a month, and she always takes care to be an early visitor. Barbara and Hannah's beauty was noted by other members of the Wordsworth family. As William later noted, almost the first words my poor brother John said when he visited us for the first time at Grasmere were, "Are those 2 angels that I have just seen?" And from his description, I have no doubt that they were those 2 sisters. Yet Wordsworth's generosity, giving Barbara creative credit and ownership of part of the poem, had completely vanished by 1843. Barbara Lewthwaite was not in fact the child whom I had seen and overheard as engaged in the poem. I will here add a note of caution against the use of names of living persons. Within a few months after the publication of this poem, I was much surprised and more hurt to find it in a child's schoolbook, which, having been compiled by Lindley Murray, had come into use at Grasmere School, where Barbara was a pupil. And alas, I had the mortification of hearing that she was very vain of being thus distinguished, and in afterlife she used to say that she remembered the incident and what I had said to her upon the occasion. Ironically, Wordsworth describes the real Barbara Lewthwaite performing her own act of creative ownership, stating she remembered the conversation. But outside the poem, Wordsworth refutes both her memory and role in his creativity. It is unclear whether he is surprised and hurt because the poem appeared in Murray's book, apparently with no permission sought and 4 stanzas cut, or because the book had come into use at Grasmere School, and as a result, the poem came to Barbara's attention and she became very vain. Wordsworth's denial of Barbara's creative role is complicated by Thomas de Quincey in a supplementary essay to Confessions of an English Opium Eater, which is titled Barbara Lewthwaite, where he writes, "This girl was a person of some poetic distinction, being, unconsciously to herself, the chief speaker in a little pastoral poem of Wordsworth's. Already, Barbara Lewthwaite had contributed to the composition of 2 impressive pictures. First, in her infancy, with her pet lamb, under the evening shadows of the mighty Fairfield. Secondly, in her girlhood, with the turbaned Malay and the little cottage child." So there he's referring to Confessions of an English Opium Eater, where he gives this wonderful description of coming downstairs and this poor servant, Barbara Lewthwaite, is terrified by the sight of this dark-skinned Malay who's turned up in the house. So if De Quincey can so plainly state that Barbara Lewthwaite was the girl in the poem, why does Wordsworth deny it? It could be that the poet resented her presumptuous claim to fame and the spoiling effects of vanity upon her childhood innocence and angelic charm. It is possible that Barbara's connection with De Quincey contributed to Wordsworth's later disdain for her, since the poet's relationship with De Quincey soured. There is a further intriguing possibility. Barbara became De Quincey's servant in 1813 after his housekeeper Mary Dawson fell pregnant. Mary Wordsworth described this as strange domestic news. Mary D. expects her confinement next month. Quincey has got a new servant, but I will not enter into the wonderful events of Grasmere, disgraceful as they are sure to be. Mary's pregnancy was presumably strange because she was not married. The wonderful and disgraceful events surrounding De Quincey and Grasmere continued. In 1816, Margaret Simpson of Nab Cottage, Rydal, had an illegitimate son fathered by De Quincey, and Barbara Lewthwaite buried her own illegitimate daughter Agnes in 1817. Despite their initial shock and outrage, the Wordsworths re-established their relationship with Mary Dawson, who became their cook at Rydal Mount, and in later life Wordsworth visited her to discuss old times. Similarly, they came to value Margaret, supporting her and her children. But there is no corresponding account of reconciliation with Barbara. All 3 women appear to have married afterwards. Margaret Simpson to Thomas de Quincey in 1817, Mary Dawson to John Fisher in 1817, and there is a record of a Barbara Lewthwaite in Grasmere marrying James Thompson in 1819. It is unclear, therefore, exactly why Wordsworth grew to dislike Barbara, but perhaps his reference to Barbara's vanity euphemistically refers to her promiscuity. I would suggest that Wordsworth revised the history of the poem as a result of the disdain he felt for this lower-class woman who proudly asserted her creative role. This potent mix of class, gender, education and assertiveness will be explored further in our next character. So I move now to a Grasmere character who appears in The Excursion. This epic poem was published in 1814 and describes a group of people who meet in Langdale. Together, they make an effort to challenge the disillusionment of one character, the solitary. Their philosophical journey takes them to a graveyard, Grasmere churchyard, poetically transplanted into Langdale, where they meet a vicar who relates the lives of a number of the graveyard's occupants. Each of these figures, including a miner, a knight, and a pair of highwaymen, are based on real local people. We will look at Wordsworth's account of a remarkable woman. This woman, sometimes referred to as the unamiable woman, remains unnamed within the poem. She is described as fearfully intelligent, surpassing many of her peers in her native vale, Grasmere. Yet her intelligence does not bring her happiness. She has a troubled marriage, and her only son's dissolute behaviour brings her further problems. She forms a habit of strident meanness in order to save money to support the family through these difficulties. Yet when sufficient is attained, she is not content and maintains her tight habits. Eventually, she falls ill and, following an anguished struggle, dies. Wordsworth later explained that this person lived at Town End and was almost our next neighbour. She has been identified as Aggie Fisher, who lived at Sykeside, just over the lane from Dove Cottage. Here's a picture of Sykeside, which I'm not sure exactly when it's from, but it would be before the 1930s, when the building next door was turned into the museum. And so that's where they lived. Aggie married John Fisher in 1774, and together they had a son, another John Fisher, who later married the Mary Dawson we heard about before. And he was born in 1778. Aggie's husband's sister, Molly Fisher, also lived at Sykeside, and she worked for the Wordsworths, cleaning, lighting fires, preparing vegetables, and helping with the weekly wash. While her husband John was a small statesman and shoemaker, Aggie came from the more affluent Macarith family. Her brother George was parish clerk, and Gawain was innkeeper of the Swan, so there is a sense that she married beneath her. Aggie died in April 1804. Wordsworth's description of Aggie in The Excursion captures her formidable intelligence and thirst for knowledge. The vicar explained she was surpassed by few in power of mind and eloquent discourse. Here is a remarkable image of her superiority. While yet a child, she, mid the humble flowerets of the vale, towered like the imperial thistle, not unfurnished with its appropriate grace, yet rather seeking to be admired than coveted and loved. Even at that age she ruled, a sovereign queen, over her comrades, else their simple sports, wanting all relish for her strenuous mind, had crossed her only to be shunned with scorn. Oh, pang of sorrowful regret for those whom in their youth sweet study has enthralled, that they have lived for harsher servitude, whether in soul, in body, or estate. Whilst this indicates her intellectual brilliance, it also suggests the emotional difficulties that attend her intelligence. She seeks admiration rather than love and acceptance, is isolated from her peers, and faces a future state of enslavement. Aggie's bondage initially comes through her marriage and is increased by motherhood, described as a strange thraldom of maternal love that held her spirit in its own despite, bound by vexation and regret and scorn, constrained forgiveness and relenting vows, and tears in pride suppressed, in shame concealed, to a poor, dissolute son, her only child. These anguished emotions, vexation, regret, scorn, constrained forgiveness, relenting vows, tears, pride and shame tie Aggie to her son. She is a captive prisoner rather than a satisfied, loving mother. His dissolute behaviour is not explained in any more detail, yet it causes some form of financial burden to the family. Aggie does not despair, but considers the problem resourcefully. What could she perform to shake the burden off? There was felt indignantly the weakness of her sex. She mused, resolved, adhered to her resolve. The hand grew slack in almsgiving, the heart closed by degrees to charity. Heaven's blessing not seeking from that source, she placed her trust in ceaseless pains and strictest parsimony, which sternly hoarded all that could be spared from each day's need, out of each day's least gain. Aggie's indignation at the weakness of her sex captures the misfortune she experiences because she is a woman. As such, despite her intellectual abilities, there is little she can do to bring more income into the family, and so she focuses all her energy into reducing household spending to save money. This is intense frugality. Placing her trust in ceaseless pains suggests less food, heating, and other basic home comforts. Indeed, Dorothy describes Sykeside as, in Aggie's lifetime, the dirtiest house in Grasmere. When eventually Aggie's saving is successful and all is re-established, she still does not find contentment, and then a sudden illness seizes her. She struggles in anguish against it, but ultimately, she, who had rebelled, was into meekness softened and subdued, did, after trials not in vain prolonged, with resignation sink into the grave. And her uncharitable acts, I trust, and harsh unkindnesses are all forgiven, though in this vale remembered with deep awe. So concludes Wordsworth's account of the bitter depths a human mind can sink to, and the lasting impression they leave upon their neighbours. Wordsworth later described Aggie as a most striking instance how far a woman may surpass in talent, in knowledge, and culture of mind those with and among whom she lives, and yet fall below them in Christian virtues of the heart and spirit. It seemed almost, and I say it with grief, that in proportion as she excelled in the one, she failed in the other. Aggie's contradictory nature, talented mind, and limited compassion are inscribed into Wordsworth's description in The Excursion. Reading the verse with a group of locals in Dove Cottage, her awful meanness was certainly striking. Yet a couple of people commented that they felt sorry for her. It was suggested that her experience, an intelligent woman who lacked outlets and opportunities to develop her talents, was perhaps a common rural tragedy at that time. We'll move now to a different tragedy, a father's loss of land and son. So our final Grasmere character is the most famous of Wordsworth's local characters, Michael, from Michael the Pastoral. This poem was written shortly after Wordsworth moved to Grasmere in 1799. It tells the story of an old Grasmere shepherd and hill farmer named Michael who owned land in the Greenhead Gill area, which is pictured here. So that's just upstream from Grasmere. When his kinsman loses money, Michael has to step in as the guarantor and faces losing the land which has been in his family for several generations. Instead, he makes the difficult decision to send his only son Luke away to earn back the lost money. Tragically, Luke is corrupted in the city and is forced to flee overseas, leaving Michael with no heir to continue his family's ancient line of inheritance. Michael is introduced as an adept and astute shepherd, an old man stout of heart and strong of limb. His bodily frame had been, from youth to age, of an unusual strength. His mind was keen, intense, and frugal, apt for all affairs, and in his shepherd's calling he was prompt and watchful, more than ordinary men. Michael is not the only person who works hard to support the family. His wife Isabel supplements their income by spinning flax and wool, a form of cottage industry that was common before 1800, but then went into rapid decline when large-scale manufacturing centralised the process in towns and cities. Following a long day on the fells with the sheep, Michael and Luke return home and assist Isabel with her tasks, such as carding wool while she spins. As such, the whole family were as a proverb in the Vale for endless industry. Unlike Aggie, Michael's keen diligence and frugality does not cause him to be mean-hearted. His relationship with his son Luke, the dearest object that he knew on earth, is instinctively loving. Old Michael, while Luke was a babe in arms, had done him a female service, not alone for dalliance and delight, as is the use of fathers, but with patient mind enforced to acts of tenderness, and he had rocked his cradle with a woman's gentle hand. Michael's unconventional parenting transcends traditional gender roles. He does not merely offer the masculine play of dalliance and delight, but also tender feminine care for the baby. Within the poem, a sheepfold, a pen built of stone to hold the flock in, becomes a central emblem that unites Michael's love of the land, his hard work, and his love for his son. Before Michael sends Luke away, he takes him upstream to the site for a new sheepfold that was to have been built by father and son. There, Michael describes his hopes for Luke's future and urges him, "Lay now the cornerstone, as I requested, and hereafter, Luke, when thou art gone away, should evil men be thy companions, let this sheepfold be thy anchor and thy shield. Amid all fear and all temptation, let it be to thee an emblem of the life thy fathers lived." Unfortunately, the symbolic power of this sheepfold as an anchor and a shield is not enough to protect Luke from the corrupting influence of the city life. In the years that follow the heavy news, Michael is reported to return to the sheepfold from time to time to continue the work. But many a day he thither went, and never lifted up a single stone. Michael then dies before he completes the sheepfold, leaving it in an unfinished state. So what were Wordsworth's sources for this powerful poem? The sheepfold was certainly one. On the 11th of October 1800, Dorothy wrote, "We walked up Greenhead Gill in search of a sheepfold." And on the 24th of October, they attempted Fairfield, but misty, and we went no further than Greenhead Gill to the sheepfold. So here's a picture of a sheepfold which exists at the upper end of Greenhead Gill today. It's probably doesn't go back as far as Michael's days of 1800, but it gives you an indication of, the setting and what it might look like in its half-finished state. So just as the sheepfold is an important symbol within the poem, introducing and concluding it, the sheepfold was also an important creative prompt for Wordsworth. Finding and revisiting it was part of the process by which he composed the poem. Like many of Wordsworth's poetic characters, I would suggest that Michael is a composite character, made up from different people, stories, and interests. Wordsworth stated that the story was taken from a family to whom had belonged many years before the house we lived in at Town End, along with some fields and woodlands on the eastern shore of Grasmere. The name of the Evening Star was not in fact given to this house, but to another on the same side of the valley, more to the north. This demonstrates Wordsworth's process of selecting and combining different biographical and geographical details to build his own poetic story. Here, taking a story that belongs to a former inhabitants of Dull Cottage and attaching it to another house further to the north, closer to the important sheepfold in Greenhead Gill. It is probable that Wordsworth first heard the family story from Anne Tyson, a woman he lodged with as a schoolboy from 1779 to 1787. Anne had worked for a Grasmere family in Rydal, the Notts, and Wordsworth writes affectionately of her storytelling powers in his autobiographical poem, The Prelude. Another important aspect of Michael is his role as a local statesman, a person who owns a small landed estate. This is highlighted by a letter that Wordsworth sent to the Whig politician Charles James Fox in 1801, where he describes Michael as an attempt to draw a picture of the domestic affections as I know they exist among a class who are now almost confined to the north of England. They are small, independent proprietors of land, here called statesmen, men of respectable education who daily labour on their own little properties. The domestic affections will always be strong amongst men who live in a country not crowded with population, if these men are placed above poverty. But if they are proprietors of small estates, which have descended to them from their ancestors, the power of which these affections will acquire amongst such men is inconceivable by those who have only had an opportunity of observing hired labourers, farmers, and the manufacturing poor. Their little tract of land serves as a kind of permanent rallying point for their domestic feelings, as a tablet upon which they are written, which makes them objects of memory in 1,000 instances when they would otherwise be forgotten. This class of men is rapidly disappearing. Michael can therefore be placed among a class of men, a representative or archetype of the local people, and not merely an exceptional individual. Wordsworth's grave warning that the class of small landowners were rapidly disappearing was true. In 1800, there were 36 hereditary statesmen in Grasmere parish. By 1885, only one. His poem Repentance, for example, describes the anguished loss his neighbour Peggy Ashburn had described in 1801, because she and her husband had sold their land to a man from London. The touch and portrayal of Michael as a father to his young son is perhaps linked to Wordsworth's friend Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who was an enthusiastic father following the birth of his young son Hartley in 1796. He touchingly described Hartley as a spirit of joy dancing on an aspen leaf. A further influence on the character was Coleridge's radical friend Thomas Poole, to whom Wordsworth wrote, "I had your character often before my eyes when writing Michael, and sometimes thought I was delineating such a man as you yourself would have been under the same circumstances." In this way, we can see the various elements that built Michael: the Grasmere location, an old story, Wordsworth's interest in the plight of Cumbrian statesmen, his friend's experience of parenting, and another friend's personality. This complicated composition process produces a peculiarly rich character. In him, we can trace particular Grasmere traits, as well as recognise common modern qualities. And as such, Michael is both local and universal. So we have looked at a child, a mother, and a father from Grasmere. I have shown you ways in which Wordsworth responded to and developed local source material, including his practice of incorporating local stories, reluctance to use real names after the Pet Lamb debacle, and integration of various sources to build poetic characters such as Michael. The poems reveal some of the pressures that Grasmere locals faced at the turn of the 19th century. The difficulty of being an intelligent woman, the struggle to hold on to hereditary land, and coping with newfound celebrity after appearing in a Wordsworth poem. They allow an insight into the rich complexity of individual lives that might otherwise have been forgotten.